He walked through the company doors every morning like any other employee, dressed in a plain uniform, blending in with the crowd. No one noticed him. No one suspected a thing. To them, he was just another worker trying to make ends meet. But behind his quiet smile and humble appearance, he carried a secret so powerful it could change everything. For 6 months, he lived a life of silence, observing, listening, and taking notes on people who had no idea who he really was. It all started when he grew tired of hearing polished reports and sugar-coated updates in board meetings. Numbers on paper never told him the truth. He wanted to feel the pulse of his empire, to see what life was really like for the people who built it with their sweat and long hours. And so, he made a decision most billionaires would never dare to take. He went undercover inside his own billion-dollar company. His disguise was simple but clever. He cut his hair shorter, wore inexpensive clothes, and even grew a rough beard to hide his face. Instead of arriving in a sleek car, he took the bus, sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers who had no clue they were riding next to the man who signed their paychecks. On his first day, he reported to a supervisor who barked orders without looking twice at him. "Get to work," the man snapped, handing him a heavy box to carry. No one treated him with respect. No one offered him special privileges. And that was exactly what he wanted. As days turned into weeks, he discovered more than he ever imagined. He saw workers struggling through back-breaking shifts with little appreciation. He heard complaints whispered in hallways about broken machines, unfair managers, and promotions that always seemed out of reach. He noticed how some supervisors pushed people beyond their limits while others turned a blind eye to unsafe practices. For the first time, he wasn't reading about his company from behind a polished desk. He was living it. One evening, after a long 12-hour shift, he sat quietly in the cafeteria, sharing a simple meal with exhausted employees. They laughed about small things, but behind their laughter, he could sense the weight of their worries: rent, school fees, hospital bills. He listened as one man confessed that he hadn't seen his kids awake in 3 days because of the overtime. Another woman whispered about how she feared losing her job because she was pregnant. Every story cut him deeper. He had built this empire, yet somewhere along the way, the human side of it had been lost. Still, he didn't reveal himself. He needed to see more. And so, he kept working side by side with his employees, lifting, packing, cleaning, and sweating through long nights. Slowly, bonds began to form. They trusted him because they believed he was one of them. He became their friend, their listener, the one who understood their struggles. And with every conversation, his determination grew stronger. But not everything he discovered was negative. Among the hardships, he found sparks of loyalty and pride. He saw employees who went out of their way to help others, who stayed late not for money, but to make sure the job was done right. He watched a young man train a new worker with patience and kindness, even though no one had ever rewarded him for it. He realized that the strength of his company didn't come from polished boardrooms or glossy presentations. It came from the resilience of the people working in silence every day. One night, while walking home, he passed by a small apartment building and saw a familiar face. It was Maria, a woman from his team who always showed up early and left late. Curious, he followed at a distance and noticed her carrying groceries up several flights of stairs. Later, he overheard her telling a neighbor that she was supporting her sick mother and 2 younger siblings. Despite her struggles, she never complained at work, never asked for favors. That night, he lay awake on his thin mattress, thinking of her sacrifice and of all the people like her inside his company. By the end of the 3rd month, he had filled notebooks with observations, stories of pain, hope, and perseverance. But he wasn't ready to reveal himself yet. He wanted the picture to be complete. He began moving between departments, taking different roles under different supervisors. In one place, he found kindness and teamwork. In another, he witnessed corruption, favoritism, and even bullying. He saw hardworking people overlooked while lazy ones were promoted because of connections. Every detail was burned into his mind. 6 months is a long time to hide. There were moments when he almost slipped, moments when he wanted to step in and correct the wrongs right away. But he knew if he revealed himself too soon, the truth would vanish, and people would put on masks around him. So he endured. He kept his head down, carried boxes, worked machines, and wiped sweat from his forehead just like everyone else. He was no longer just a billionaire. For those 6 months, he was a worker, and he felt every bit of what that life demanded. And yet, all the while, one burning thought stayed alive inside him. When the time came, when he finally revealed who he really was, nothing in this company would ever be the same again. The 6 months were coming to an end, and he could feel the weight of what he had discovered pressing down on him. Every day had shown him a side of his company he had never truly seen before. The skyscrapers, the luxury offices, the glossy reports, those were only the surface. Beneath it all, hidden behind the noise of profit and progress, were lives, stories, and struggles that no balance sheet could ever measure. He had learned the rhythms of the factory floor, the sound of machines clanging, the tired laughter of workers during their short breaks, the silence of exhaustion that filled the room at night. He knew which supervisors inspired their teams and which ones crushed spirits with their words. He knew who worked because they dreamed of a better future and who worked simply because they had no other choice. He had tasted their reality, lived their hardships, and in doing so, he had changed. But as the end of his undercover journey approached, one thought consumed him. How would they react when they discovered the truth? These men and women saw him as one of them, a fellow worker who shared their burdens. To reveal that he had always been the billionaire behind the empire, they would feel betrayed, shocked, even angry. He wondered if they would ever forgive him for hiding the truth. Yet he also knew he couldn't stay silent forever. The moment of revelation was inevitable. One evening, near the end of his shift, he overheard a group of employees talking in hushed voices. They were frustrated about how their complaints were always ignored, how the higher-ups made decisions without ever stepping foot on the floor. One of them sighed, "If the owner ever walked a day in our shoes, maybe things would change." The words struck him like a thunderbolt. They had no idea that for the last 6 months, their wish had already come true. He was there. He had walked more than just a day in their shoes. He had lived an entire life beside them. That night, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, he decided the time for truth had come. The next morning, he walked into the building just like always, but this time his heart pounded faster. It was his final shift in disguise. He carried boxes, worked the machines, and exchanged friendly words with his colleagues. Yet inside, he was preparing for the storm that would follow once they knew who he really was. After the shift ended, instead of heading home, he stayed behind. A meeting had been called. All employees from different departments were gathered in the large hall, curious about the sudden announcement. Workers wiped sweat from their brows, supervisors stood tall, and the air buzzed with questions. No one knew what was coming. He walked to the front, still dressed in his simple uniform. Whispers spread through the crowd. Some wondered if he was being promoted, others if he had gotten into trouble. No one expected what was about to happen. He picked up the microphone, his hands steady, his voice calm. "For 6 months," he began, "I have stood beside you. I have worked the same hours, carried the same loads, and faced the same challenges. You knew me as a co-worker, but there is something I have not told you." The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes locked onto him. Some frowned in confusion, others leaned forward, curious. He took a deep breath. "My name," he continued, "is not the one you think it is. I am not just an ordinary worker. I am the owner of this company, the very empire you build every single day." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the silence shattered. Gasps filled the hall, voices erupted in disbelief, and jaws dropped open. Workers turned to each other, shaking their heads, trying to process what they had just heard. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. Others stared at him, as if seeing him for the very first time. One man finally shouted, "That's impossible. You're one of us." He smiled sadly. "I wanted to be. I needed to understand what life was like in your shoes. So I lived it, quietly, without telling anyone who I was. And in these 6 months, I have learned more than I ever did in 6 years sitting in boardrooms." The reaction was mixed. Some clapped their hands over their mouths, tears in their eyes, realizing he had truly experienced their hardships. Others felt anger bubbling inside them, anger that he had deceived them, that he had watched their suffering in silence without stepping in. A woman in the front row finally spoke, her voice trembling. "If you knew what we were going through, why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you reveal yourself sooner?" He looked straight at her, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Because if I had revealed myself on day one, everything would have changed. People would have acted differently around me. Supervisors would have hidden their behavior. Problems would have been swept under the rug. I needed the raw, unfiltered truth. And now I have it." The hall quieted again. People exchanged uneasy glances, torn between outrage and admiration. He raised his hand, and the murmurs faded. "I did not come here to expose you," he said. "I came here to listen, to see, and to feel. And now that I know the truth, I cannot ignore it. Things will change. Not tomorrow, not next year, but starting today. Because this company is not built on profit alone. It is built on you. On your sweat, your sacrifice, your stories." Slowly, the crowd's expression softened. Skepticism lingered, but hope flickered in their eyes. They wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his words carried weight. But trust is not given, it is earned. He stepped down from the stage and walked into the crowd, shaking hands, looking people directly in the eyes. "I see you," he told them. "I see your struggles. And I promise, this is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of something new." And though many questions still hung in the air, though many hearts still wrestled with doubt, one thing was certain. The revelation had changed everything. The billionaire was no longer a distant figure in a corner office. He was real, he was present, and he had lived their lives. Now, the true test would begin, proving his words with actions. The hall was still buzzing from his revelation, but what happened afterward would define his company forever. In the days that followed, words spread like wildfire. Every corner of the building, every office, every department whispered about the undercover billionaire who had lived among them in silence for 6 long months. Some employees still doubted it, others were angry, but most were simply stunned. They wanted to know what would happen now. For him, there was no turning back. He returned the next morning, not in disguise this time, but as himself. No uniform, no bus ride, no cheap apartment. He arrived as the man they now knew him to be, the owner, the leader, the billionaire behind it all. Yet his heart was different. He wasn't walking in as the untouchable CEO. He was walking in as someone who had seen the cracks, felt the struggles, and carried the weight of those 6 months with him. The executives in the top floors were the first to feel the change. When he entered the boardroom, the same place where he had once sat detached from reality, he didn't sit at the head of the table. Instead, he stood. His voice was firm but calm as he addressed the team of managers and directors who had been insulated from the truth for too long. "I went undercover," he announced, "and I saw everything. The good, the bad, the forgotten. What you hide in reports, I saw with my own eyes. And let me be clear, things will not continue this way." The faces around the table shifted uneasily. Some tried to defend themselves, others stayed silent, but none could escape the truth. He had been there. He had lived it. There was no argument strong enough to erase his experience. He began making changes immediately. Safety protocols were reinforced, broken equipment replaced, and the unfair promotion system was dismantled. Supervisors who had bullied their teams were removed, and those who had inspired and uplifted others were recognized. But more than policy, he worked to shift the culture itself. He wanted every worker to feel valued, every voice to be heard. One of his boldest moves was to create an open forum where any employee could speak directly to him, without fear, without middlemen. The first day the forum opened, hundreds showed up. Some hesitated, worried about speaking freely to the man who signed their checks, but when the first brave workers shared their story, others followed. They poured out their frustrations, their hopes, their ideas. And he listened, truly listened, just as he had during those 6 undercover months. Among those who spoke was Maria, the woman who carried the weight of her family in silence. She stood trembling at first, but then her voice grew steady. She spoke of her struggles, her dedication, and her dream for a better life for her siblings. The room fell quiet as she spoke, and for the first time, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. When she finished, he stood, crossed the room, and shook her hand. "Your strength," he said, "is what this company is built on. And from this day forward, you will not go unnoticed." That moment became symbolic for everyone watching. It wasn't about favoritism, it was about recognition. It was about seeing the invisible, giving voice to the silent. And in that instant, hope spread like fire through the company. Still, not everything was smooth. Change is never welcomed by all. Some executives resisted, unhappy with their comfort being disrupted. They whispered behind closed doors, questioning his choices, warning him that the company could lose profit if he focused too much on people instead of numbers. But he didn't waver. He had seen too much, felt too much. He knew the truth. A company that ignores its people may shine on the outside, but it rots from within. And slowly, results began to show. Productivity rose, not because people were pushed harder, but because they were motivated, respected, and valued. Accidents declined as safety became a priority. Employees who once felt invisible now walked taller, prouder, because they knew the man at the top cared enough to stand beside them. 6 months undercover had changed him, but the real transformation was only beginning. He was not just leading a company anymore. He was leading a movement within its walls, a culture of dignity, respect, and unity. Months later, he returned to the same cafeteria where he had once eaten quietly in disguise. This time, when he entered, the room erupted into applause. Workers stood, smiling, some with tears in their eyes. They weren't applauding a billionaire. They weren't applauding a boss. They were applauding the man who had chosen to walk in their shoes, the man who had chosen to listen. He raised his hand to quiet the room and said only one thing: "Thank you for showing me the truth. I promise I will never forget it." And he meant it. From that day forward, every decision he made carried the weight of those 6 months. Every policy was shaped by the stories he had heard, every change fueled by the lessons he had lived. The world outside soon heard the story too. News outlets picked it up. Headlines screamed about the undercover billionaire who revealed himself, and people everywhere were stunned. Some called him a genius, others called him brave, but those who had worked beside him simply called him real. In the end, his revelation wasn't just about shocking a company or making headlines. It was about reminding everyone inside and outside the walls that success isn't built on money alone. It's built on people, on their sacrifices, their dreams, their everyday struggles. And so, the man who once hid behind boardrooms and numbers became something far greater in the eyes of his people. He became a leader worth following, not because of his wealth, but because of his heart.